I'll jump to that first. What do you see on the screen up there? Alfred Hitchcock. And everybody knows that that's Alfred Hitchcock, right? And you can count the lines. I count 9. And I find students and faculty of all generations actually know that profile and actually can sing, right? Gounod's Funeral March of the Marionette, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And even if you weren't in the 50s watching the television show, you know the profile. What has surprised me, I think actually Cliff Adelman pointed out the profile, there's something intellectually lively about that profile. You can use it as a heuristic. You can use it as a metaphor. The degree qualifications profile does not give you every single little nuance and shade and tone of a degree. But when you see it, you know what it is. And that intellectual surprise has really actually motivated some of what I find going on in the 9 different states that AAC&U is working with on the degree qualifications profile.
All right. I think what's absolutely fascinating to see right now is something that I think I always dreamed about before, and that is a focus in higher education on enduring learning. That we have moved beyond in this commitment and into the work of AAC&U before this, to looking not just at courses as individually responsible, but how we work together to develop these enduring attributes or qualities in people. And that's not easy. And what it's going to require for us is to work collaboratively and collectively to say, what does this trajectory look like across the lives of our students? How will we address transfer students? How will we address students who require much more attention early on? They may not have had the same set of background as other students. And how do we bring them all along? So what I envision now is a very strong commitment to collaborative design principles of how the outcomes play out in our courses. Not to say any longer it's your responsibility in your course to get everybody to write, but that I may be at the beginning of that. Who else is going to join in so that there are multiple, diverse, and ample opportunities for students to learn? And that doesn't mean the students are going to get it all at the same time, same place, but there's a much greater chance, should I say, that increasingly larger number of students will perform at higher levels, which is really what we're after, if we come together and become co-designers of the curriculum and the co-curriculum, as many of you pointed out, because the learning is happening and can happen all along the trajectory, but it is a question of us working together to say, and what are the kinds of assignments that we develop over the period of 4 years? How do students travel with what I may have taught into the next set of courses? How does this come together, and how do they know it in the work that they prepare for us and they produce in their electronic portfolios or the work that they show us? So this is an interesting partnership, but a very new partnership between those of us who teach and the learners to work together to bring people along chronologically, to look at multiple places for them to demonstrate their learning.
Hi, so I'm kind of the odd duck out on this panel, not a DQP expert. My name is Cable Green. I'm the Director of Global Learning for Creative Commons. So I live in the world of open educational resources and working with governments who are trying to think about how do you use public funding to get the highest return on investment for the public dollar in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of student success, in terms of improving society writ large with public education. And my job description, quite simply, is to help everyone on the planet access a high quality, affordable education by leveraging 21st century technical and legal tools. And that's what Creative Commons is. So I think for me what's interesting about the DQP, given that it's everything that Paul said, is that the public right now, and you've seen this in the press, is really questioning what's the value of post-secondary education. And it's the question, quite bluntly in the press, in the New York Times, Time Magazine, and everywhere else you look, is it worth it? And they're asking, is it worth the public investment? And individually, people are asking, is it worth the private investment? And as you know, the private investment has amounted to significant individual debt. And this is especially true in private universities, but is also true in public institutions. And as you know, student debt in the United States passed $1 trillion last year, which is now more than all of the credit card debt held by all of us in the United States. And textbook costs have exceeded 25% of the cost of even attending your community colleges. So these questions are being asked, and they're being asked in very serious ways in legislatures around the country, and the U.S. Department of Education are asking these questions. And at the same time, there's multiple disruptive forces which are making this conversation accelerate and making it more challenging, interesting, but challenging. So you all have seen the press lately around MOOCs, and you've seen Udacity and Coursera and edX and all of these Ivies and universities that are throwing their courses out to the world, making them free. My job is to make sure they are also open. So we're helping them openly license those so you can take and modify the curriculum as you see fit. Badges are being pushed to challenge existing forms of accreditation. And in fact, so I work with the Mozilla Foundation, and Mozilla quite simply became tired of working with all of us in traditional higher education, have skipped over us, and they're now going directly to the Fortune 500 companies who are hiring students that you're educating, and they're working backwards. So they're going to business and say, what competencies and skills do you need? And we will create the new architecture around what accreditation means in the 21st century around discrete, modular skills and competencies, and then we will hand those back to the education establishment, and either they will be able to fulfill that need or not. So these are all very disruptive, disaggregating effects that make the conversations that we're having about improving what we do more difficult and more challenging. So my sort of big question, and I hope to explore this more this afternoon in my breakout session, is what does DQP have to say about all that? How does it add to that conversation? How can it help us have a constructive conversation given all those crazy factors that are in play right now?
Before you surrender the microphone, let me just ask a quick follow-up. If you were to have it to do over again, as we will, and create a second edition of the DQP, how might it be more responsive to this broader contextual challenge that you've just defined? What are the things that it doesn't do now that it really ought to do next time around?
So I'll answer that with a process answer and not a content answer, if that's okay.
Sure.
The challenge in the work that I do is to get existing organizations and processes and business models to suspend for just long enough their belief in their existing systems to envision what the future might look like given the tools we have today. So if you had a blank slate, how would you create accreditation today? If you had a blank slate, what would you do with your associate's degrees? Would it make sense, for example, in K-12 Common Core, given that, so let me talk about K-12 for a second, given that there are 45 states and 3 U.S. territories that need Common Core curriculum, what they're about to do is spend $8.3 billion of money that they frankly don't have to buy new Common Core aligned curriculum and textbooks using all the same models that they've always had. That's option A. Option B is, let's suspend existing models for a minute, given that we've got common needs around new Common Core curriculum and textbooks and professional development. Might we work together? And in fact, Creative Commons is having this conversation with 6, 7 foundations right now. Can we spend, instead of $8.3 billion, can we spend about $100 million RFP for all the curriculum content we need, all standard aligned, make it freely available under an open license to all the districts in the country, and then have the districts, put in a 20th of that amount of money to maintain it. I think we can have similar conversations in higher ed, and I'll talk more about that later.
Okay. Would either of you like perhaps to address that question before we move on, the question about how might it be more useful next time around?
Well, I'll add a bit. We're working in 9 different states to test the DQP, and working
Really
also
needs to
with
be
the
about 3 inches.
3 inches. Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, I didn't want it to hiss at you. Okay, thinking across state lines, I think, is one of the things that the DQP could urge people to do. As we work with people in 9 different states, and also through a convergent project that is sponsored by the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education, looking at an interstate passport, we've been thinking about large numbers of students, in fact, 27% of undergraduate students who are collecting some parts of their learning by crossing state lines. What Cable has said now about the disruptive change of the MOOCs is going to intensify some of that boundary crossing. In fact, I know that in some states there are intentional programs to come up with DQP-like profiles so as to make online learning more accessible to more people. And we're going to find that's happening in Wisconsin through a flexible online degree that's looking at the DQP, and in California in the community colleges that are talking now about using OER to make an online Associate of Arts degree. So with all that happening, I would say the next edition of the DQP should start to think about broader collaboration and urge people to move beyond individual campuses and beyond states.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thanks. Peggy?
This conversation really makes me think about the fact that it's possible for students to learn through multiple media, different ways. The question is, I think, what's the demonstration of that learning that we would wish to see? And there may be various kinds of demonstration for it, but I think the world is so open now that we have to see that we have students who will do some of their learning online, some of them 2-year institutions, some at a 4, some going back the 2-year institution. We see this swirl taking place. But I think the question always is, what are our expectations? What are our criteria and standards of judgment that we will apply to the work that students produce, regardless of where then that work is coming from? Significant, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to the audience for a few moments. Do we have enough microphones so that we don't need that one? We at least have 1 and 2. Excellent. And so the question here would be to follow on there, from your perspective, given the kinds of issues that you are confronting, some of which we heard about in the last hour, are there ways that this resource might be more useful to you, or are there problems that you're encountering that our 3 advisors might be able to give you some advice on? Are there ways, in fact, in which this process might be smoother, more effective for you, and can we have a discussion about what some of those ways might be? Never ask 3 questions when you really want to ask 1. Yes? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ulrich. I'm here at Lane. Couple of things come to mind for me. One of them is, as the DQP looks at these levels of degrees, that it get more fine-tuned and focused on the arc of learning that occurs at every level. So case in point, a sequence, say, in biology, where students start out in the fall as novices and are carried along in a very thoughtful, intentional way to become more expert at the end as a 2-year college student,
yes,
prepared to go on to 4 years, but they have really mastered skills of critical thinking, analysis, at a very high level in a bounded set of content. So it's not that they don't have the intellectual skills of a master's degree, it's that they have a more narrow set of content boundaries for that introductory course.
Right.
So that's something, you know, as a two-year college person, I would love to see addressed. And then the corollary to that,
Well,
I think,
before you
okay.
go to the corollary,
Okay.
is that something the DQP should do, or is that something that the disciplines should do kind of in the context of the DQP?
I think the DQP should invite that. And I think in its current structure, the verbs that are left in the AA level don't do that for us.
Okay.
They're simply too low level.
Now your corollary.
Yeah. The corollary is on the assessment side. Because while we can work really hard to describe these outcomes, I think there's a lot of work on professional development, on the means of authentic assessment for these various levels, and helping faculty see what would it mean to really assess, are my students able to demonstrate this in what is sometimes the artificial context of the classroom, and in what ways could we make that less artificial? I like to talk about stopping, you know, let's not play school, let's learn.
Yes.
Let's gain knowledge. So how do we know we have that knowledge, and how do we assess that? So I think that I can almost envision another book that's the assessment levels. Here's the outcomes DQP, here's the assessment DQP. What are those various tools and methods that would really bring that to life?
That's a wonderfully constructive suggestion, and maybe Susan and then Peggy might also have a...
Okay. Yes, I hear that on campuses all over the country. What people have discovered pretty quickly, and this is actually quite exciting, is that we've now got some tools that we can put together toward assessment. So, for example, you can use the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes and the associated value rubrics. I'm thinking a lot of you know about the value rubrics and the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes, and I'm seeing a lot of heads. So what's missing, if you think about those broad and the LEAP Essential Learning Outcomes and the assessments that you can do of the value with the value rubrics, is that you're not really talking about the level of progression to the associate's, to the baccalaureate, to the master's degree. And one of the interesting kind of intellectual puzzles here that I think people are responding to, again, looking for that profile at those levels, is a set of learning statements that you can actually connect to what you see as a progression of learning in the value rubrics and tie back to essential learning outcomes, which are, in fact, aligned with many of the learning goals that states have. So I think there is a lot that's available, but we need to build on the use of some of those tools and find ways in which that added dimension of progression of learning statements can, in fact, work to be assessed with tools we already have.
Yeah, the interesting point you raise, I can share with you an experience I've just had in my own state in which we were using the value rubrics, applying it to student work. And what we saw very clearly is that the delineations between 2-year and 4-year, just to take that example, aren't that clean. That we saw many examples of students at 2-year institutions at higher levels. So I think we have to be careful in thinking about this, of saying that there's something so absolutely rigid. And there are times, sometimes, when I look at the DQP outcomes and I find they're at more of the operational level, and I don't think that it's that clean. And in fact, what we should be saying as a nation is, how do we increasingly graduate students at higher levels? And those levels can be happening in multiple places at our institutions. So I'm concerned about the artificiality at times, I think, that I see, that it's just, oh, stops here. And it leads to then thinking that there isn't a connection between what's going on in the 2-year and the 4-year, when I think that's what I'm seeing as such a productive conversation in our state between 2-year and 4-year institutions. We're in it together.
Absolutely.
Part of it.
Yep.
So I'm going to address just the first part of your question. So I work at home, and on my wall I have my degrees, and I've got my PhD and my 2 masters and my baccalaureate from just up the street here at Lewis and Clark College. And if I look at those degrees, and I was not me, and I said, "What does Cable Green know? What's he good at?" You'd have no idea. I mean, my PhD from Ohio State doesn't even say what I studied, right? All it says is Doctor of Philosophy. Like, it doesn't tell me anything. So we've got this weird system in most countries, certainly in ours, where this piece of paper acts as a proxy for what someone is supposed to know. Now, if you talk to me, I'd tell you I have a degree, a PhD in education psychology, and here's what I studied, et cetera. But unless you talk to me, there's no way to know that. And unless I take the time as a learner. So I think we've got a major problem with the signals that we're providing in terms of the information we provide, especially to employers and others who might want to engage in our students around their discrete skills and competencies. And so what I would hope that the DQP could add to this conversation is how can, given you're focused on outcomes of the DQP, how can it be used to display discrete skills and competencies publicly in the same way that badges are talking about that, in the same way that, Gary, raise your hand. Right, you want to talk to this guy back here about e-portfolios. He's been working on this for years about how can a student have artifacts, have projects, display their competencies, not just with words on a resume, but actually show their performance of what they're capable of doing. Right? Here's what I know. The current system around degrees as a signal for what I know, frankly, is garbage. And so, I mean, and it's so bad that today, if I wanted to get my data out of the educational institutions that I attended, all 4 of them, I would have to go to the registrar's office. I would have to request my transcripts. Good luck even getting through that rigmarole. And then I'm probably going to have to pay for it, right? As if the first, I don't know, $200,000 I spent on the 4 degrees wasn't enough to have access to my own data. Ohio State's going to charge me another $50 to get access to my transcript. And when I get that, it's probably going to be a faxed copy. It's not going to be machine readable. It's not going to be digital, very likely. And it won't be at the discrete level of information that I want and need to communicate my skills and competencies. And so I think that this is an opportunity. This frame is an opportunity to unpack a lot of essentially what's a broken system around the data that we have on students and that they have on themselves, and to empower them using the DQP as a frame so that they can better communicate what they know, how they know it, when they learned it, so that as they transfer, as they're trying to get jobs, as they're engaging in grant opportunities or research or whatever it might be, that data is much more fluid, right? We need to empower the students with that and not lock it up in our registrar's office where it is today.
I think we should go to Gary. Before we do that, I want to ask Cable if he finds anything of merit in what the Bologna process has accomplished in terms of the diploma supplement, which might get at least part of what you're talking about, and the European credit and transfer system, which provides that central clearinghouse for machine-readable educational credentials. Are these examples that we should at least be paying some attention to?
Now, see, this is a trap because this man is an expert on the Bologna process. So I'm going to let him answer his own question.
Well, we actually, the suggestion was occasion for me because we have a gentleman in the room who's here from Belgium. What was it? Where? Yes, from Belgium. And so he kind of reminded me of what the Bologna process has to teach us. Would you like to say just a word or two about the diploma supplement, ECTS, anything other that we might have to learn?
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, I brought one with me actually, because I'm doing a breakout session this afternoon for those who are interested.
What number, Johannes? What number breakout session?
I think it's number 10. I brought a diploma supplement with me, and so indeed we have what we could frame and hang on the wall, and then there's actually here in this diploma about 7 or 8 pages explaining in detail the principles behind the education or the track that was taken and the degree that was awarded, the way the assessment took place, the principles behind it, the outcomes, who was involved, a whole lot of detail that if you want I can let pass around and you can have a look at it. It also gives information in ECTS, and I can talk about that as more in detail. It's a little different than the credit system in the United States because it is based on student workload, and if I understand it in the US, it's based on faculty contact time. But that approach on student workload, of course, kind of reinforces his student learning outcome approach and gives another intensity to what was studied and the intensity of how the outcomes were reached, how many credits were obtained. And that is also explained in detail in that supplement. I don't know that.
Thank you.
A bit.
Thank you very much. And Gary, did you want to rise to the occasion? Yes?
I want to put a plug into Lumina. So if you're watching, last year we submitted a digital transcript portion, and they told us that they would consider funding it the next time. And so we've got a great collaboration here with you and Gary and Cable Green that Oregon's going to come back, and we're going to submit a digital transcript proposal. And we're hoping that next year, this time, you would have funded it. Thank you.
I don't represent the Lumina Foundation, but I'm more than happy to indicate that that was mentioned here at this conference. Gary?
I don't have it. I have my chance in breakout session number 4.
Okay, all right, very good. Before we move to the next question, any other, I asked that kind of bipolar question, you know, do you have issues with the DQP, or are there suggestions you would make for the next time around? So you can take either one of those. And yes, here in the corner.
So one of the questions I have is where is it, how does it represent folks in the career technical side in the two-year colleges? I think it's a great ambition to look at 2 going to 4, going to masters, but there's a fair amount of workforce nationally that provides very valuable, productive service, and a 2-year degree is the terminal degree. And there's a fair amount of critical thinking, health professions in particular. 77% of your healthcare is provided by people with 2-year degrees in this country. So I think for students, if there's a student version, I wouldn't want to discount the AAS degree being a valid form of learning and critical thinking and all of those other outcomes that society would value, and have that be minimized because it's not 4 years of traditional instruction.
Wonderful question. I'm going to ask the panel to respond to it. I would like to indicate that you are not the first person to have raised that concern. I think it's a very valid one. At the same time, when I met last year with the ACCJC, I used the phrase terminal degree, and they said, in our perspective, there is no such thing. What you need to understand, they were instructing me, and I didn't forget my lesson, was that this particular degree may ideally and fully serve the needs of an individual at this point in his life. Don't assume that that is going to be terminal, but value it fully at the time in terms of that need. So was I being instructed properly in that, or?
Yeah, I agree. No, there's people, you know, that certainly can go on, and
right.
But there's also people that should feel that they're making solid contributions.
Absolutely.
And that their degree has worth, and it's not less valuable to them or to society because it doesn't have a B in front of it.
Wonderful, yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. Very good. Yes?
Just a quick response. In the state of Wisconsin, which is experimenting with the DQP, there are between 700,000 and 1 million adults with some college who haven't finished, and a real need for workforce development. So I would say that some of the work that the Wisconsin colleges are doing in career and technical education with the DQP is very clearly framed in that way. Can we profile what the applied associate's degree might be? And can we furthermore do that in a way that will allow students, when they want in their lives, to progress to something called a BAAS, and define what that means in applied arts and sciences learning that's global but focused, for example, on freshwater science. So there are colleagues around the country who are asking that question about the DQP, career and technical and workforce education, and I think it's a good opening and also allows for people to think beyond the degree to where they might go 5, 10, 15 years from now.
I appreciate that you brought that up, because I think when the DQP first came out, and I understand it in its fullness now, I really see this as a commitment to students' ability to integrate their learning. And so when you talk about people leaving after a career for 2 years, that's at a pretty high level. To be able to say, I am a problem solver, I am a problem identifier, I use quantitative reasoning, I look at an issue from multiple perspectives, those are the same things required there. And I think the fascinating thing about the DQP is to be able to say how in a claim I'm making, an argument I'm making, a perspective I'm taking or wishing to share, would my integration of quantitative reasoning, for example, enhance that particular claim? How would my analytic thinking, how would my understanding of history, of sociology, of all those, provide me with deeper perspective on this or relate to other people about it? And so really what's so fascinating about this at any level is the degree to which I think we are asking people to bring things together, and not so much to silo, but to say, how does my understanding of quantitative reasoning shape my response to this? How does my understanding of history and patterns in history enable me to look at this more broadly? So we're really looking at people who can bring in a lot to be able to respond to it. And I think that's really what the 21st century is asking for.
We might turn this next question both to you and to the panel, because I was asked to make sure that we include those who are participating by webcast. And I do invite those who are participating by webcast to let us hear from you. But as we wait to hear from you, if you had one suggestion to make to some viewer of what we're up to, and they're considering in their institution taking a look at the DQP. They've heard about it. They don't really know what it is, but they're interested on the basis of this conversation. And what one piece of advice might you want to offer to the absolute neophyte, someone who is on the threshold of seriously considering the use of the DQP? Do you have some advice for our listeners? And even if we don't have listeners, it'll be interesting to hear from you on this subject. What advice would you have, kind of on the front end? What about communication with colleagues? What about ways of introducing the possibility of a heightened emphasis on assessment? Yes, sir. Right here in the front.
Ken Doxey from the University of Oregon. I fit your description, I think, in that I'm a DQP skeptic. I'm concerned about what it means in terms of what we do. I wonder if it's the next thing we'll be doing, and next year there'll be something else. But I'm teetering closer to the brink here, and it comes from what I will give as advice, but I really want feedback as to whether everybody else feels I'm missing the boat. And that is, DQP looks at where your students are before they leave your institution. Says they can do these things, they know these things. If that were our focus of assessment, I could see doing that. The problem I have as our university's chief assessment person is that I can't see doing that while at the same time I'm worried about assessing where my students are with that knowledge and ability when they get here, where they are a couple years down the road, and so on. So the value added piece is hard, especially as we're hearing that the more students are coming from different places, their knowledge is coming from different places. So how do I get my benchmark for where they were when they started at the U of O, and how do I show that we added value to them before they graduated? So DQP, I'm feeling stirrings, would suggest that I don't have to worry about that. I just have to worry about where they are before they leave the U of O. Can our culture deal with not worrying about value added and have accountability simply be how our students do, where they are now?
I'm going to ask for Peggy's help on this, but before Peggy responds, just want to say in terms of, is the DQP the latest brand new idea? I would say it isn't. I mean, people have said, there are really no new ideas here. And one response on the part of the authors is, well, right. I mean, the effort was not to suddenly invent new outcomes, but to draw on a wealth of experience, institutional experience, accreditor experience, international experience, in order to frame in a particularly useful and accessible way kind of the state of the art with regard to this shift to what students should know and be able to do. And so in that sense, I don't see it as, kind of total quality management light that's going to, a fad that will disappear. I see it as another step along the way in terms of being much clearer about what we want to accomplish. In terms of yes, and then before we go to Peggy, we'll go to...
Just a quick bit of advice. I'm Krista Johns, visiting from the ACCJC in California. My advice to the brand new person is to not be put off by the super fancy cover and the beautiful typeface font of the report, because it looks like a product, something that someone's already done. It's finished, and you either buy it or you don't buy it. And it looks like it comes from a very fancy, very expensive place that you may not be in love with. So my advice would be
good advice.
To read it as a document that has some interesting material, and it's designed to be worked with and to get messy and muddy with. And you might not get that in your first impression from looking at it.
Thank you. That's very good advice. It reminds me of a report made by the representative of the University of Chicago reporting to the Higher Learning Commission Board. He said, to begin with, you've got to understand that the University of Chicago faculty are going to be immediately opposed to anything printed in pamphlet form. And your suggestion is right on with that. Peggy.
All right. That's a great assessment question. I simply would have to say that we cannot live on hope and just look at the end and say things are going to be all right, because I can tell you right now they won't be. That I think we have to have a commitment to this from the moment students matriculate or transfer in, to looking at what they do bring, and quite honestly, I guess what I'll talk about tomorrow is the obstacles that they have to overcome that we may not even know about now until we do some deeper assessment. This is as much learning about their processes of thinking as it is the products that they create. So I think there has to be some monitoring from baseline to formative along the way, as well as at the end, because there's just the assumption if we do this, that somehow it's going to work out. But I can tell you no two students think the same way. And what we've got to uncover are the obstacles, the blocks, the misinterpretations, misconceptions that they will travel with as far as they can if we don't encounter them early on.
Susan, did you have a perspective?
Well, I guess to pick up on what Peggy just said, was working with Middlesex Community College in Massachusetts and UMass Lowell, trying to unpack the DQP and invite people in. And it was a very useful experience. I'm picking up on your idea of that pamphlet. That's a little bit off-putting. Actually take one of the learning statements from the DQP in a community of practice and try to figure out whether it works or not. And we pretty quickly got to the point of realizing that there were some really important understandings about quantitative reasoning that students weren't getting. And though the learning statement for the associate level in the DQP for quantitative fluency seemed not quite rich enough, it really was interesting to have faculty from two institutions to talk about that and to think about what would be better. And for example, quantitative reasoning in philosophy might include logic, and you might discover that your students at the associate level are having trouble with logic, and you might discover that baccalaureate level philosophy students are likewise having trouble with logic. What can you do together as a community of practice to uncover what's behind it and to help the students learn more? That was very useful.
So my answer is going to sound weird, but it'll make sense at the end.
Well, just wait for your meaning to unfold, that's right. Maybe...
It won't take very long. Okay. So there have been reports, many of them, looking at the top 50 industries in the United States, including education as being one of them, and ranking them by their strategic use of technology. And of course, the punchline there is education tends to be dead last in our strategic use of tech. Today, the conversation, same analysis, same conversation, but it's around the use of data. So, of course, big data is the conversation in every industry, and the question is, are we using data in higher ed strategically to meet our goals and missions? Most reports that are coming out now put us very close to last, as compared to other industries that are strategically using data. And then the third point is that when people talk about disruptive forces on industries, so the Clayton Christensen's disruptive innovation theories analyses, people ask, well, okay, why isn't public higher education been fundamentally disrupted yet in the same way the music industry has it, et cetera? And so maybe it won't happen, right? And my answer to that is that the reason we haven't been disrupted as fast as other industries is because we've got two shields around us that other industries don't have. One shield is accreditation, and the second one is essentially subsidy from the government, primarily in the forms of state financial aid and federal financial aid, in addition to some direct subsidy from states, and this is especially true of community college budgets. Those are being questioned, the accreditation system and the value of it and whether or not it makes sense. And legislatures around the country that we're talking to are questioning where they should be putting money, as are voters vis-a-vis the outcomes educational outcomes they want in their citizenry. And so the question, so here's the point. So the advice I would give to a community college or a university that was considering using the DQP is, hey folks, you need to know this disruption is coming, and believe me, it is. I work with several that are working aggressively to disrupt the existing models, and they're well-funded in all sorts of ways, and they don't carry the same burdens that you carry in terms of budgets, contracts. They simply don't have the same inertia. They're operating on Silicon Valley speed and with Silicon Valley business practices. So it's coming. And the question, or the advice I would give is, can the DQP, and using it as a frame, help you be very clear about what the value is that your institution brings to this new disaggregated world that's coming around education? So most reasonable people who buy into the disruptions coming still look at existing institutions and say, that's where the faculty expertise lies. That's primarily where a lot of the student services lies, although those are being disaggregated as well. That is probably where the assessment will still take place for most of what's going to need to be done in what the public expects for education. And a rubric like the DQP, I think, helps the university, the college, think strategically about what its value point is in this new disaggregated world that's coming. And that's a tough conversation to have because nobody wants to be disaggregated.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that there is time for the panel to address one of the questions that I actually gave to them in advance. Otherwise, today's been pretty much a kind of bait and switch process. They've heard a lot of questions that weren't on their sheet, and there are some here that will go unanswered, but I do want them to reflect on what it is that they might, what are the good things that they might say about the Oregon project when they are elsewhere? What are the lessons that we can already learn from what you're doing here how you've organized yourselves, just what this room full represents. Would you reflect a little bit on that, the kind of Oregon as exemplar and the usefulness of that as we continue the work with the DQP? Susan, why don't you?
All right, well, I've been working with folks in Oregon. This is my 5th year. Some of you were involved in the original Compass project, and we're now working with you on the DQP. Oregon's been very, very active as a LEAP state. And so with many of you, I have watched the development of the AAOT with great interest because you were extremely collaborative in building the AAOT, the Associate of Arts for Oregon Transfer. My question and my recommendation to you is that you take the DQP seriously at the associate level and put it up against the expectations of the AAOT and think about what it means for specialized knowledge. There are 5 big learning areas in the DQP. Broad knowledge, which is general education, specialized knowledge, which is connected to a degree. And think about scaffolded progression toward a degree. And you can think in terms of engineering that you want to build from the first year. You could do that with philosophy. But if the AAOT doesn't give you any clear indication of expected progressions toward majors at the baccalaureate level, it might mean that students are going to have to retake a lot of courses. Maybe this is an opportunity to address specialization within the context of the AAOT.
And that good work, if it takes place here, would also be worth bragging about elsewhere.
All over the country.
Yes, yes.
So mine's very short, and of course I have to say something about open for as a last word. So given that DQP is a shared conversation nationally, and there's a shared need there for meetings like this and for professional development activities and for reports and best practices and barriers and how they were overcome in different states. My advice to you is as you're producing those pamphlets, those professional development materials, those reports, other things that are useful in talking about, adopting, getting over challenges of the DQP, to share those, to openly license those with a Creative Commons attribution license so that people don't even have to ask for your permission to take it, to modify it, to use it, and they can just do so, and what they will give is attribution. They will give credit to Oregon. And those who share the most will be the ones who are the most influential in the community. Sharing very quickly develops a meritocracy, and those that have the good ideas and are sharing what they're doing will quickly be leaders in the conversation. And you're already leaders in the conversation. I ask you to simply put a CC BY license on it, put it on your website, and share with everybody else.
I am deeply impressed with the layers and levels of players that you have engaged in this, from K through 20, through having been involved in grants before, such as Achieving the Dream, and of coming together then as a body of people committed to increasingly advancing students' learning. The piece that I think that I warmed to the absolute most, to tell you the truth, was the degree to which you involved students in mapping the DQP or involving them in this. And if there's one piece that I would like to recommend that we all think about, it's how we bring students into this from the moment they matriculate, how we orient them towards this pathway, and how they might develop their own maths towards it, to how advising shapes this. Do we have discussions with our students such as, I know you want to avoid taking math, but that's really an area where you do need to improve, to the way in which we articulate and share those outcomes with our students, to the way in which we design our syllabi that announce to them what the outcomes are, what the pedagogies are that we pursue to advance them, and how we're going to assess them or how they believe they they should be assessed, to how they choose work themselves that represents these outcomes. So this is really about a partnership. So you have that feeling of partnership in this, but I think the partnership with students is really important. How we bring them along, how we critique their work, how they critique each other's, and how they internalize the criterion standards of judgment that you build will be significant.
And isn't it wonderful that that word students appears in the first line of their objectives? Well, we have about 4 minutes before lunch, and so I'd like to conclude by suggesting that you're at a professional conference, either in the state of Oregon or nationally, and someone you know comes up and says, you know, I hear you're spending some of your time working with this DQP. What satisfaction do you find in that? Why are you doing that? And I would like to get just 2 or 3 very individual, very personal reflections on that before we open the doors and send you out to the fillets that they've been grilling to your specification. Who would be willing to respond to that from a personal point of view? Why spend time with the DQP? Why work in this project? Yes, sir.
Wayne Hook, Portland Community College. I think for me, it's helping me own my teaching more, the content, the curriculum. It's making me think this is, in fact, what I want my students to get. And I've become much more rigorous, and I'm a hard ass now compared to last.
But in an intentional way. That's very good, yes. Anybody else? Anyone else? Let's get 2 or 3 more to weigh in on this. I mean, what brought you here today? You're here and you're involved. Yes, please, right in the back.
Well, I'm new to the DQP, so this is a new experience for me, but I see the value in it because I came from clinical psychology doctoral program, and we have rigorous requirements for every school based on the APA's recommendations, and I know that I can take my degree to any state in the United States, and those qualifications will be recognized. Doesn't matter what institution I attended, as long as it's APA accredited, that has meaning. And so I want that for my community college students.
Bravo, bravo. Anyone else? Maybe a final word. Yes, sir, right here, right in the back.
I would just add, it made me think a little bit about both the perspective I take from a teaching perspective, which is rather rigorous, and you want outcomes, and you want to make sure to maintain standards. And then I'm remembering a little bit of what Peggy said and reading some recent reports and thinking about watching the EPIC video that just came out and talking to my nephews who like learning online with each other and like grading each other. And the outcomes that they achieve working together are just as important, but we often forget about bringing them into the conversation and how important students are as a part of this conversation as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Peggy Mackey, Susan Albertine, Cable Green, would you help me thank our illustrious panel?